Hey everyone, welcome to the lecture on Russian punk rock from the Soviet era to Pussy Riot. This is Alex Herbert, um, and I'm sorry that we have to do this electronically, but I hope that you get something out of it. This is actually pretty lucky on your part because normally when I do these lectures, I don't use PowerPoint slides. I mostly read from the book and tell the narrative that's in the book. And so you guys are lucky that you get not only the slides with photos, but you also are going to get some video, which I hope that the quality of the audio and the video works out. I'm not super familiar with Zoom, but we're giving this a go and we'll see if it works. So when I do these talks, there's a few elements of punk rock that I like to stress as we follow the history of punk rock in Russia. Those four elements are style, music, spaces, and politics. And it's my opinion that these are the four essential elements of punk rock. Uh, of course, I'm defining punk rock on what we consider commonly to be punk rock in the West. Of course, um, punk rock can vary from country to country and culture to culture. But in any case, we're going to follow these four elements and see how they morph and how they apply at different times. And they're also just good markers for noticing that evolution that are worth paying attention to. Punk rock has a certain style. That could be spiky hair and leather jackets, or it could be band T-shirts or something like that. The music is also pretty particular. It's usually fast-paced for four time signatures, um, and not as talented maybe as something like prog rock or something like that. Punk rock is definitely defined by spaces, that is DIY venues, actual official venues, um, anarchist bookstores, cafes owned by members of the punk scene, restaurants even, especially in Russia, places like that. And then of course, politics. Politics broadly conceived, it can be direct um, direct politics aimed towards a specific person in government, maybe Trump or something like that, or it can be politics that are addressing larger social issues like feminism or animal rights or something like that. So in this lecture, we're going to go through the narrative history of punk rock in the Soviet Union and in Russia. It's focused on Russia in particular because to study all the Soviet Union after 1991 would have required more time than I had and more languages than I know. So we're going to limit it to Russia. And like all great things in Russia, we're going to start the history in Leningrad, which later becomes St. Petersburg. So pictured here is uh, all the way on the left at the bottom, laying down, is a character known as Svin, which means pig in Russian. He is considered the progenitor of Russian punk rock. And this photo comes from the collection of Yevgeny Yufit, which if you recognize that name, he is the founder, the creator of the necrorealist film tradition. Um, and he becomes recognized for some of his films. Um, and the story begins in Leningrad partially because of its proximity to the West. It has always been considered, since its founding, Russia's window to the West, window to Europe. And because of that, uh, certain people in Leningrad, given the right technology and importantly the right finances, were able to intercept BBC radio transmissions from the roof of their apartment buildings. Now, what we get in this period in 1978, around there, are characters like Svin, whose grandparents go to the roof of their apartment, intercept BBC radio transmissions, and then after the grandparent or the parent is done listening, the child gets to listen to music radio from the BBC. So this is where Sven, Yevgeny, and other people involved in their very close-knit group here for the first time, the Sex Pistols and the Boomtown Rats and other bands coming out of Britain in the late 70s. The Clash even. You can imagine hearing this music but not knowing what any of the musicians looked like. You get a sense that it is a different style of music, but you don't yet know that there's a different physical style too, not just musical style. Um, and also in this early time period, it's important to remember that Sven and friends aren't quite into the musical aspect of being punk rock, if you can use it that way. They're more into hooliganism, as you can see here, playing dead in front of some babushki outside, and testing the cultural conventions of late Soviet Leningrad. So, for example, there's stories of Sven and Yevgeny Yufit shoveling snow in the nude, and then running away as soon as they're called out, and just basic forms of hooliganism before they get into the musical aspect of punk rock. Um, but they do eventually get into the musical realm of punk rock. At least Sven does, and some other friends. Ufit doesn't, but some other friends do, and they start amateur bands in which they record demos in their apartments using fancy equipment. Again, it's important to note that most of these people in this small group of 6 or 7 younger 16 to 18-year-olds are come from relatively well-off families. So Sven, for example, his mother was a famous ballerina. His father lived in Israel and sent money to the family every so often. So the Sven record and audio collection became renowned amongst the youth in Leningrad for a time. But in any case, eventually they do start to form a band, a collective band called Автоматически удовлетворительный, or the Automatic Satisfiers in English, which is a rough, you know, translation or parody of the Sex Pistols. And it becomes widely recognized by both the KGB and the people who are part of the official Leningrad rock scene that there is a group of kids, and this group is growing, that are interested in having spaces or in going and attending rock concerts. And so by 1986, the frontman for Akvarium, which is one of Russia's biggest rock bands, along with some members of the official Leningrad Komsomol and other youth organizations, helped to found this very first venue for amateur rock artists in Leningrad called the Leningrad Rock Club. Again, the Leningrad Rock Club. And what you find here when you interview people who attended shows at the Leningrad Rock Club was that it was broadly known as a sort of house where KGB agents could police youth activity in Leningrad. It was an area of control. It was not a space that belonged to any kind of punk scene. It was a space that belonged to the authorities as a way of control. So here, this picture is of the Leningrad Rock Club, and the way that bands would gain admittance into the Leningrad Rock Club is that they would have to bring 3 copies of all of their lyrics to a board of members with Komsomol, with Boris from Akvarium, and some maybe KGB officers who would have to approve the lyrics first and then grant the band admittance. So you can imagine that punk rock, at least its political rendition, would not have been admitted into the Leningrad Rock Club, which isn't so bad because AU, Автоматически удовлетворительный, and other bands that come around Perestroika, their lyrics are not political really at all. What most of Sven's lyrics are about public intoxication or doing something stupid or just basic hooliganism. And so here we have a video of AU finally were granted admittance into the Leningrad Rock Club in 1988, and here they are playing the sixth festival of the Leningrad Rock Club. And what you'll see is Sven, he not only does he look the part of a Johnny Rotten, but he also kind of plays the part. And you'll see that he starts to undo his pants on stage, which was his public cultural offense, if you could say that. So let's skip ahead a little bit.
Дождь стучит по крышам, льет как молоки из ведра. Все прятались как крысы и засели по домам. Только небольших кретинов выбегают на бульвар. С диким воплем и неоно бьют из по кустам. Это несомненно, это к нам пришел. Значит, будет что-то хорошо.
Well, I think you get the idea now. So before we get to Sven's pants dropping, we can stop it here. Again, it's worth emphasizing that the lyrics at this time are not really political, but the style is there. So here you get the band, two members of the band, Object Nasmeshik, Object of Ridicule, who very much, as you can see from here, they embody the style of punk rock. If you watch videos of Object Nasmeshik, they kind of look like The Clash. But the lyrics, again, are distinctively non-political. In fact, maybe the only political song that they get into at this period is called An Epoch for Us, which is a song in praise of perestroika and the possibilities that perestroika is making possible for the people of their generation. The one exception to this political rule, which is worth getting into, that we will get into, is Siberian punk. But first, I want to go back to these 4 points and stress that when looking at the Leningrad Rock Club years and perestroika, we see the emergence of punk style and roughly punk music. But again, those spaces and the politics are completely left out. They haven't emerged yet, or they haven't been given license yet within a punk scene. Again, the exception to all this is the phenomenon of Siberian punk, which is spearheaded more or less by Yegor Letov and his band Grezdanskaya Oborona. Letov creates or kind of fosters this nascent grassroots scene in Siberia, in Omsk and Novosibirsk. He runs a studio inside of his apartment home where he records his friends and his friends' bands. And Grezdanskaya Oborona becomes very politically oriented, not so much in the anarchist tradition or anything like that, but kind of in the songs that describe the depressive atmosphere of living essentially in the middle of Siberia, the problems of bureaucracy in Russia or in the Soviet Union, and stuff like that. Letov is followed around the Soviet Union, or at least Russia, by the KGB. Eventually, they catch up with him, I think in 1986, or maybe a little bit before that. They arrest him. They send Letov himself to a mental hospital, and they send his brother, who played guitar for the band, to the army. Eventually, the two get out. They reform Grezdanskaya Oborona, as you can see here. They garner so much attention that the Leningrad Rock Club eventually does give them admittance, and they play the Leningrad Rock Club in 1988. with heavily censored lyrics. Um, and to sort of bookend the Siberian punk phenomenon, it's important that after 1991, Yegor Letov becomes involved in founding the National Bolshevik Party in Russia. And so a lot of his political credibility and his followers drop out because of the outright nationalistic affiliations that he acquires after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which leads us to collapse, and to post-Soviet punks, as I call them. Here we have a picture of Koroly Shut, which you might know. They were a pretty popular band for a long time. And what we'll see in this post-Soviet moment is the widening of spaces. And so this photo takes place in Club Tom Tom, which was an underground venue founded by the violin player Sieva Gekel, the violin player from Akvarium. He goes to CBGB in 1991. He sees what it's like there, and he thinks that he has to go back to St. Petersburg and found a venue just like CBGB, a place where amateur musicians can play any radical music that they want to without the type of censorship from the Leningrad Rock Club. So you get the beginning of spaces like this, DIY spaces more or less. Club Tom Tom in St. Petersburg, Jerry Rubin Club will come in Moscow. And as you can see from Sievageko's actions themselves, you also get an influx of Western influence that it begins maybe in the late 80s, but it really starts to skyrocket in the 90s. Not only can the music be imported into Russia, but so can albums and T-shirts and other band paraphernalia, which becomes important later. And finally, the post-Soviet moment is distinctly a moment of this sort of opening of an ideological vacuum. You can imagine growing up in a country and being taught that the world exists a certain way, and then overnight being told that it doesn't exist that way anymore. And so a lot of people in the 90s are the music remains apolitical. It seems to me that the people I interviewed remembered the 90s as a period where politics were just so pervasive in everyday life that when they came to these spaces like Tom Tom or Jerry Rubin Club, they didn't want to talk about politics with each other. They just wanted to party and do drugs and, and cause a ruckus. So this next video is a video of Koroly Shut at Club Tom Tom in 1993. Koroly Shut is a great band to play from this time period because towards the end of the 90s, they become one of the first international breakthroughs of Russian punk, playing massive stadiums. They are also a lot of people who are in their 20s today remember Koroly Shut as their first exposure to punk rock in Russia. And so Koroly Shut becomes a very important band for this history, and they start off at Club Tom Tom. So let's skip ahead a little bit to the song Koroly Shut. Well, you get the idea now. So now you can see that the space is more familiar as a punk venue. It very much looks like CBGB. The distance between the band and the crowd is also starting to collapse. And it's starting to look more like punk rock that we know. You can see the band has spiky hair. The music is remaining fast and pretty similar. And at the same time that this club Tom Tom and Jerry Rubin Club are going on, there's another punk movement going on in Moscow. And so this is the first time in the presentation that we are switching to Moscow. There's a reason for that. The reason is that punk rock just doesn't really exist in Moscow that pervasively until the 90s. And the phenomenon that we're switching to is, I call intelligentsia punk, which I call it so because it's a small group of people who are into music. They brand their style of punk rock or lyricism as existentialism, but I consider it almost a anti-political political music. So they have songs against the traditional Russian intelligentsia uh, and stuff like that. And you can imagine that while it's not obviously political, there's political implications to the people that they're singing against. And it's also important, this is also an important scene because this, in very many ways, can be considered the precursor to sort of fusion between art and punk that Pussy Riot will try to claim later on. So if you're familiar at all with Anya Bernstein, who is a anthropologist now at Harvard, I believe this is her apartment. And so now, I mean, she's good evidence of the fact that people who grew up in this scene of playing small shows for each other and in their apartments go on to be pretty big intellectual characters. Also going on in Moscow at the same time in the 90s is the phenomenon that I call the Moscow Giants. And this refers to, in particular, three bands that are the first in Russia to try to commercialize punk rock. Pictured here is the band Naive, who is probably the first of the Moscow Giants. There's also the band Tarakani, and Distemper is a ska band that also comes from Moscow at this time. Naive, for example, get international recognition by allowing Maximum Rock and Roll from the Bay Area to publish their first record. But it's important to recognize that not only in Leningrad, but also in Moscow, the music is pretty universally still apolitical. Naive have one song about a soldier who a punk soldier that is drafted into the army and then he goes crazy and he drives a tank around, but that's about as political as Naive gets at this point. And it becomes a problem, and it becomes such a problem that towards the end of the 90s, there's this one incident that's recalled by a lot of people where a neo-Nazi comes to the front of the stage at a Distemper concert and does the Sieg Heil motion. The band stops, they ask him to leave, and then the next day they go on a St. Petersburg radio station and they declare that those sort of forms of nationalism, that nationalistic ideology is not allowed at their concerts, and that you will be evicted from the concert if you're engaging in that kind of behavior. And so you can imagine that this action, it sounds minor, it's just a pronouncement they make on the radio station, but it actually polarizes the scene, what is the punk scene, indefinitely at this point. So again, remember, you have an apolitical punk scene where everyone is coming together into these spaces like Tom Tom and Jerry Rubin Club, where they feel like they belong. And now all of a sudden you have bands taking sides and excluding an entire half, at least, or maybe a little bit less than half, an entire segment of that scene from these spaces and saying you don't belong anymore because of your ideology. And this sort of split, this fracture in the punk scene really comes to a T by the time we get to the 2000s. It becomes very violent. You have neo-Nazis who start waiting outside of concert venues like Tom Tom and J. Rubin Club for people leaving so that they can jump them. You have stabbings on the street, and neo-Nazis calling bomb scares into concerts in order to disrupt them. And so in the late 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of the underground punk movement really dies out because when people are scared to go to venues. And what you also get at this time period is a sort of uh, embourgeoisement, I guess, of the punk scene in many ways. Because as you have those Western influences coming into Russia, only certain people with a certain amount of money are able to buy CDs and T-shirts from Western bands, and so these outward expressions of wealth become another alienating element that um, sort of exclude the working class people, the working class kids from suburbs who want to belong to the punk scene. Um, so to summarize all of that, more or less, you have a split in the punk scene between more nationalistic leaning groups and either apolitical or left leaning groups. And within that left leaning group or the apolitical group, you have sort of a embourgeoisement, a middle class affiliation or that they become. And so later, what we get beginning around 2000 and 2005 is that those two movements will come to a T. But first, let's recap with the four elements of punk and where we are at the end of the 90s. So we have the style, as you saw with Naive. Uh, they look like a punk rock band. They sound like a punk rock band. They have the musical style that is very much parroting off of Western sounds. In some cases, the bands like Tarakani have songs that sound exactly like a Green Day song. They Russian punk is acquiring the spaces of punk rock, Tom Tom, Jerry Rubin Club, other DIY venues, even apartments, spaces where um, that's away from authority, where elements of punk culture can flourish. But again, it's missing the politics until we get to the end of the 90s with that split in the punk scene. Politics don't really exist in Russian punk that pervasively. Well, until the 2000s, of recognizing that the scene had split and that the more left-leaning, the non-nationalistic part of the scene is more middle class. Certain characters from working class suburbs, particularly in Moscow, seek to create their own punk scene that is glorifying working class values of punk. And very obviously don't have the money and the finances to import Western band T-shirts. Um, and they're also willing and determined to fight for the spaces where they can hold their concerts and other gatherings. And so in the book, you get introduced to Moscow's anti-fascist scene, which is more or less embodied by this one character, Pete or Peter. Um, Peter founds a band called Pravorochная Linyenka, which translates to straight edge in Russian. It sounds goofy even in Russian, but the name literally means straight edge, with the intention of engaging neo-Nazism not only in punk rock but in Russia itself. Uh, this is the absolute radicalization of punk rock. If we went from 0 in the 90s, we're going straight to 10 here. Um, it's left-wing politics. The insignia on top of the photo on the left says SHARP, which stands for Skinhead Against Racial Prejudice. Uh, and the whole ideological project of straight edge is to coax neo-Nazis out and to engage them on the street, literally. And at first, when people were describing these street brawls to me, I thought that it was just a bunch of people who were obsessed with military culture and exaggerating their movement. But it turns out that once you see the photos, it's all true, and once everybody's stories start aligning, it turns out to be pretty true. So what you get, for example, one tactic that Pete and his crew would do is they would book a concert for straight edge in the city of Kirov, for example, take a random provincial city, and all of these kids from Moscow would go out to Kirov. They would publicize the show online on social media or wherever, knowing that neo Nazis would catch wind of the show. They would go out to Kirov, all of these kids from Moscow suburbs, and they would engage neo Nazis. There was no show; it was all a sham to get people to go out. Every once in a while, they would play shows, but as you're about to see, the shows are um, more like rallies than they are actually concerts. And so this is a video of straight edge playing underneath a bridge in Moscow, undisclosed bridge in Moscow. Um, and you'll see that this concert is much more like a rally, like a ritual. It even features Pete singing out of a megaphone rather than a microphone. Let's skip ahead a bit. Right, so you get the idea here. Um, So the Moscow Antifa, of course, it's not only Moscow. Anti-fascist chapters open up throughout Western Russia. Uh, the peak of their activity is 2005 to 2008, in which 4 or 5 members of the anti-fascist crew are killed by neo-Nazis, um, uh, until the Russian government eventually establishes Center R, which is the Department for Combating Extremism, and they consider both anti-fascists and neo-Nazis to be extremist groups, and they crack down on these youth groups uh, pretty quickly. So for the most, you know, majority politics kind of disappears after 2008, or at least it becomes very quiet, less obvious in the punk scene, um, until we get to Pussy Riot and recent developments. So the anti-fascist scene is sort of the pinnacle of this narrative, because it's the first time where politics enter Russian punk. Uh, but again, it goes from almost 0 to 10 overnight. The spaces are being defended. More spaces are being carved out. This is the beginning of restaurants and street cafes and uh, libraries that are catered towards anarchists and punk rock countercultures. The music sounds definitely like what we consider to be punk rock. The style maybe is the only thing that is a little bit more ambiguous. As you saw, straight edge, all of those guys sort of just dress in regular fashion. Part of that was that they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. And the other reason is that they just didn't have the money for all the flashy punk gear that some punks get. So after 2008, as I mentioned, the political themes kind of died down. It's heavily repressed by the government. It goes even further underground. Pete will also leave straight edge. He is they stopped playing shows. They feel like they had annihilated to the extent that they wanted to the Nazi threat, and that the purpose of the band no longer existed. And so the scene kind of normalizes again. You can go to a show in 2009, 2010, and not run into a neo-Nazi and not have to worry about being jumped by one outside the venue. Which leads us finally to Pussy Riot, and it's not my intention to have Pussy Riot at the end of the presentation. It's just that the book as well as this presentation works chronologically, and Pussy Riot is very much at the end of the chronology. Um, but if we're thinking about Pussy Riot's place in this entire punk history and punk scene, and we're using those four elements of punk to think about that place, then Pussy Riot holds a very tenuous place in the history. Uh, According to all of the interviews, I conducted over 100 interviews. They are historically not a part of the Russian punk scene described here. So they were never seen at any of the spaces that are considered punk spaces, any of the DIY venues or even major venues. Uh, the band itself, the music doesn't really have the sound that we're familiar with punk rock, um, and they don't really have the traditional punk rock style. Although it's fair to consider the masks that they wear and the bright colors as a punk rock style. Um, but they definitely have the political aspect of it, which is their claim to punk rock fame, if you will. But I'll argue that more importantly, Pussy Riot does belong in the history of Russia's punk scene for what their actions permitted and what it mobilized in Russia. And so, of course, there are female-fronted bands in Russia before Pussy Riot, going all the way back as far as I could find to 1988. This one band called Zhenskaya Bolezen. Um, and women are in the punk scene throughout its history, playing both as musicians and photographers, and selling merch and doing a variety of roles, booking shows. Um, but the lyrical content of these female-fronted bands, or predominantly female bands, are not explicitly touching on any political or feminist themes. Zhenskaya Bolezin, for example, said that they began playing music because they just wanted to play their music and they wanted to be respected by other musicians, whether they were male or female. In the 90s, you get a lot of women that I interviewed that were involved in the punk scene in the 90s said that they got involved in playing in bands because they wanted to impress men and they wanted to get husbands. Of course, it's in retrospect, so I don't know if that's actually true. But what you get with Pussy Riot and the actions of Pussy Riot is actually a mobilization, I guess, of women in the punk scene, or at least a new opening for women in the punk scene to express ideas to other members of the punk scene, male members of the punk scene, that formerly you wouldn't have heard before. Um, so this is a picture of the band Pincher. They're from Moscow, but this is them playing in Tver. Uh, this band existed long before Pussy Riot with pseudo-feminist themes. Some of their songs are against the conservative ideologies of Russian cultures, like singing against a woman's subordinate role to men, or the women's role in the household and stuff like that. But again, they're playing these shows at small DIY venues, and the lyrics are not they're not the main aspect of the band itself. The main aspect is the music. It's through Pussy Riot where you get those themes that really come out and they become the driving force behind the music about everything else. Which leads us to today, and I think that today punk rock is a reflection of both its past and everything that it has gone through, from the Soviet period of repression through to the anti-fascist movement, and it feels the effect of Pussy Riot. And so the last band that we can kind of listen to is called Stress Hold. They're from Moscow. And as you'll hear, Stress Hold, it's my opinion that Stress Hold, what Stress Hold does at their concerts, which is to have very explicitly feminist ideas and political ideas in the beginning of the show, is made possible by the actions of Pussy Riot. So let's go ahead and we can listen to Stress Hold from Moscow.
Мы выступаем против любых видов дискриминации, которые люди порождают в привилегированных позиций. Мы выступаем против государственных знаков и государственной символики. Мы считаем, что каждый имеет право на самоидентификацию, имеет право сам распоряжаться своим телом. Помните, что безопасность – это всего лишь иллюзия. Некоторые вещи крайне естественны, но их покоятся в мироздании, а лежат на поверхности своего имения. Порой умудряются впасть в буддистическое забвение и смертие. Поэтому хотел по-любому, что все мы разные, что мы с собой, мы не можем. Не подарить сами себе свое желание.
So in that video, it's my opinion that you get the culmination of all four elements of punk that we're talking about. You get definitely the style, sound of punk, the space. You can see that the gap between the band and the crowd has been completely collapsed, and you get the politics, and you get the politics in very obvious and upfront ways. Not only are the male members of the band wearing dresses, but the songs themselves, the rant that Katya does in the beginning is very politically oriented. And so that sort of brings it full circle, the history of punk rock in Russia from the Soviet period to today. If you are interested in reading the details of this history beyond just my narrative, if you want to hear it from the mouths of the people themselves, you can order the book at my website. It's at punksaround.com or through Microcosm Publishing. The book in the middle is a self-published compilation of short stories that I put together from my time researching for the book. It has all the things that the book doesn't have about my personal experiences. So the book itself is an oral history with some chapters that are formally written by me. But for the most part, the idea of the book was to allow the actors to speak for themselves. Because even though I became a part of the scene, it's still very much not my scene to claim or to dictate how to tell the narrative. The book in the middle is more of my personal stories. And then I also publish a fanzine that each issue usually features somebody from Russian punk. And before we go, I guess I can conclude by just addressing the point of the title of the book, What About Tomorrow? The point of the title is to remind us in the West and also Russian punks themselves that there are certain altruistic aspects of punk rock, such as straight edge culture, veganism, and general multiculturalness, openness, that are starting to have serious influence in Russia. And so, if you were in Russia in the early 2000s in Moscow or St. Petersburg, then you know it was virtually impossible to find a vegetarian, let alone vegan restaurant anywhere. Now, if you go to either of those cities or even some of the provincial cities, you will find vegan restaurants. And importantly, you will find that the people working at those restaurants usually look like they're into alternative music, whether that's punk or something else. Again, this is the creation of important spaces that punks are a part of. You also find more of that inclusion of both male and female in these spaces. Although with all of these advancements, harm reduction initiatives in Russia, food not bombs initiatives in Russia now, thanks to punk rock. With all these advancements, there are still limitations. One that I usually talk about is the difficulty I had in finding a homosexual to interview for the book. I really wanted the perspective of a homosexual, and this individual one night told me that he was gay and that he would love to do an interview with me. When I met up with him and started recording, he finally admitted that, oh, I'm not really gay. I was just joking. And so you can see that this sort of cultural conservatism still exists in even the Russian punk scene. Somebody who claims to be anti-fascist using somebody else's identity as a joke. The band Stresshold, for all of their innovation, they are disliked by certain purveyors of the scene, people in charge of influential fanzines and stuff like that, simply because they're women and they're very outspoken women. Um, so again, you have this sort of progress that's happening thanks to uh, certain aspects of punk rock, but it's not fully there yet. And so the book, in that case, is sort of also a call to arms for Russians and for punks in the West to start thinking about ways that we can expand membership of our spaces, expand membership of our scenes to be more exclusionary and to remember that um, the world is full of diverse and different people that might have similar interests to us. So that's it. Thank you so much for paying attention and following with the narrative. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm sorry that it had to be electronic. If you would like to ask any questions, feel free to email me. Um, and as I said, if you're interested in the book, you can find it at one of these websites here. And that's all. Thank you.